The party that never ends New Year's Eve is supposed to be about excitement, celebration, and the promise of a fresh start. Instead, I found myself trudging through the cold, damp streets, my breath forming brief, ghostly clouds before vanishing into the night. My plans had fallen apart hours earlier when my friends, one by one, canceled on me. Staring at my phone, I realized I couldn't go home. Not yet. There was something unbearably lonely about spending the night in silence while the rest of the world celebrated. The streets were strangely deserted. Even the usual city sounds, the hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, seemed muffled by the fog that crept through the alleys like a living thing. I turned a corner and nearly walked into him. The man was tall, wearing an impeccably tailored black coat and a hat that obscured most of his face. His sudden appearance startled me, but his posture was composed, deliberate. Before I could mutter an apology, he extended a hand. Between his gloved fingers was a single card, gold foil catching the faint streetlight. "Tonight," he said, his voice smooth and low, "you shouldn't be alone. Join us." He pressed the card into my hand, his touch strangely cold despite the leather glove, and vanished into the mist before I could respond. The card was heavy, its surface embossed with ornate lettering. The Manor, an exclusive New Year's celebration. Address, 13 Greyfall Road. I didn't recognize the address, but something about the card felt compelling, almost magnetic. The edges of the gold foil shimmered as though they were alive. It was madness, of course, to consider going. I didn't know the place, the host, or anyone who would be there. But something stirred inside me, a mix of curiosity and a desperate need to escape the hollow ache of the night. A taxi pulled up as if on cue when I stepped to the curb. I slid into the back seat, the address falling from my lips before I even realized I'd spoken. The driver said nothing, his face unreadable as the car moved silently through the mist. The streets became less familiar, the buildings taller and more menacing. The glow of the city faded, replaced by winding roads and towering trees that seemed to lean closer the farther we drove. I glanced at my phone. No signal. Eventually, the car stopped. "The Manor," the driver said flatly, his tone devoid of warmth. Before me stood a massive mansion, its dark silhouette looming against the foggy sky. The windows glowed faintly, warm light spilling onto the stone steps that led to an ornate front door. Music drifted through the air, soft, lilting, yet somehow dissonant, like a waltz played just slightly off-key. I hesitated, glancing back at the cab, but the driver was already gone. The street behind me stretched into darkness. With a deep breath, I stepped forward. Inside, the air was warm, almost too warm, and the scent of champagne and roses filled my lungs. The ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, their light refracting in 1,000 dazzling colors. The room was filled with guests, all dressed in exquisite evening attire that seemed decades out of place. Gowns of silk and velvet, tuxedos with tails. A woman in a silver dress swept toward me, her smile wide and almost too perfect. "Welcome," she said, her voice honeyed but hollow, "to the celebration of the century." I tried to ask her how she knew me or who had invited me, but she merely laughed and handed me a glass of champagne. "Drink," she urged, "and dance. The night is young." At first, I allowed myself to be swept up in the revelry. The music was enchanting, and the guests moved with an elegance that seemed choreographed. I sipped my champagne, its taste oddly metallic, and tried to relax. But as the hours wore on, unease began to creep in. No one seemed to age as the night progressed. Faces stayed frozen in identical expressions of joy, their laughter continuous and unnervingly consistent. I glanced at the grand clock on the wall. Midnight was moments away, the hands poised at 11:59. I felt a rush of relief. Soon, the night would end, and I could leave. The clock struck 12. Cheers erupted, the band crescendoed, and champagne flowed freely. Yet as the seconds ticked by, I noticed something horrifying. The clock's hands weren't moving. Panic clawed at my chest. I turned to a man beside me, his face pale and expression serene. "Is the clock broken?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. "Broken? Why, no," he replied, tilting his head with an unsettling smile. "Midnight is the perfect hour. Why would you want it to end?" A wave of dizziness swept over me, and I stumbled toward the exit. The heavy doors wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pushed. I tried another door, then a window, but each led me back to the ballroom, where the music played on and the guests twirled endlessly. The woman in silver reappeared at my side, her smile unchanged. "Isn't it wonderful?" she said. "A night that never ends. Perfection, don't you think?" "No," I snapped. "I need to leave. Let me go." Her laughter echoed through the room, unnaturally loud. "Leave? Oh, darling, there's no leaving the party. You belong here now." The music grew louder, dissonant notes grating against my nerves. Around me, the guests' faces began to blur, their features twisting into grotesque, shadowy forms. I staggered backward, my pulse racing as dread took hold. Something was very, very wrong. The walls of the ballroom seemed to close in on me as the music swelled, its hypnotic rhythm now a discordant screech that clawed at my mind. I stumbled through the crowd, dodging the twirling dancers, their laughter ringing hollow and mechanical in my ears. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the edge of the room, desperate for a moment of quiet. I found a narrow door half hidden behind a velvet curtain. Gripping the ornate brass handle, I yanked it open and slipped inside. The air here was colder, staler, and the light dimmed to a sickly amber glow. I realized I was in a narrow hallway lined with gilded mirrors. The mirrors reflected the ballroom I had just left, but something was wrong. The guests in the reflections were not dancing. They stood still, their faces expressionless and eyes wide with terror. When I turned to look back at the ballroom, the dancers twirled as if nothing had changed, but in the mirrors their movements were jerky, marionette-like, and the shadows behind them twisted unnaturally. I kept moving, my footsteps muffled on the plush carpet. At the end of the hallway, a single door loomed, its frame cracked and splintered. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the opulence of the ballroom. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung thick in the corners. A single desk stood in the center, and on it lay an open journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. I approached cautiously, the faint scent of decay tickling my nose. The journal's entries were written in hurried, slanted handwriting. Trapped. Every year, the same faces, the same song. Midnight never ends. They feed on us, our memories, our emotions, everything that makes us human. There is a way out, but it requires an offering, a willing exchange. The final entry was smudged, as though the writer's hand had trembled. I thought I could do it. I couldn't. I'm still here. The room felt colder as I read. A low whisper, like the rustling of leaves, began to fill the space. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward me, reaching out with claw-like tendrils. I stumbled back into the hallway, clutching the journal. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an indecipherable cacophony. As I ran, the mirrors on either side shattered one by one, shards scattering like glittering snow. Each broken pane revealed glimpses of something beyond, a writhing dark void filled with faint, ghostly faces. The hallway finally spat me out into the ballroom once more. The music had stopped. The guests stood motionless, their heads all turned toward me. Their once perfect smiles were gone, replaced by blank stares that pierced through me. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Mr. Gray's voice cut through the silence like a blade. I spun to face him. He stood at the center of the room, his silhouette tall and menacing. "There's no escape," he said, his tone almost amused. "Not unless you're willing to play by the rules." "What rules?" I demanded, holding the journal like a shield. Mr. Gray stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "The party is eternal," he explained, his voice smooth and eerily calm. "It feeds on your desire to leave, on your desperation, but there is one way to break free." I already knew what he was going to say. "An offering," I whispered. He smiled, a slow, predatory grin. "Precisely. Convince another to take your place, and the loop will release you." The words sent a chill through me. I looked at the frozen guests, their faces blank and unreadable. Each of them had made a choice, or failed to, and now they were trapped, their humanity slowly drained away. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I won't do it. I won't condemn someone else to this." Mr. Gray's expression didn't waver. "Then you'll remain here forever." He gestured toward the clock, its hands still fixed at 11:59. "The party waits for no one." The guests began to move again, but their motions were slower, more deliberate. They advanced toward me, their eyes glinting with something inhuman. The music started up once more, louder and more dissonant than before. I clutched the journal, flipping through its pages in desperation. The words blurred before my eyes, but one line stood out, etched deep into the paper. "Deception binds. Only truth can break the loop." A thought struck me. If the loop thrived on lies and desperation, perhaps the key wasn't an offering, but defiance. I had to confront the truth, my own fear and selfishness. Turning to the woman in silver, who now stood closest to me, I met her gaze. "You don't have to stay," I told her. "None of you do." Her head tilted, and for a moment her face flickered, a glimpse of something frail and human behind the polished mask. But then she laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. "Foolish," she said, but her voice wavered. The others hesitated, their movements faltering. Mr. Gray's smile disappeared, replaced by a sneer. "You can't break the rules," he snarled. "I don't believe in your rules," I shot back. The room trembled. The chandeliers flickered, and the music warped into a deafening roar. Shadows rose around Mr. Gray, his form twisting into something monstrous. But as I stood my ground, the guests began to fade, their forms dissolving like smoke. The clock struck 12, and for the first time, the hands moved forward. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on a cold, empty street. The manor was gone, and the invitation in my hand crumbled to dust. The city buzzed around me, alive with the sounds of New Year's morning. But as I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Somewhere, faint and distant, the echoes of a waltz lingered in the air. The relief of escaping the manor didn't last long. At first, I convinced myself it was over, that I had broken free. The streets of the city were alive again, filled with the sounds of distant horns and laughter. A soft snow had begun to fall, blanketing the empty sidewalks in white. But something felt wrong. My footsteps echoed too loudly, and the air seemed unnaturally still, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The occasional passerby didn't meet my eyes, their faces blurred and indistinct, like figures in a half-forgotten dream. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of that cursed party. The faces of the guests haunted me, their empty smiles flashing behind my eyes every time I blinked. Mr. Gray's voice echoed in my ears, low and menacing. The party waits for no one. I reached my apartment just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. Fumbling with my keys, I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The familiar sight of my small living room brought a brief sense of comfort. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, my jacket draped over the back of a chair, an empty coffee mug on the table. I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted, and reached for my phone. The screen was flooded with messages, friends wishing me a happy new year, wondering where I'd been. I typed out a reply, but my fingers froze when I noticed the time. 11:59 p.m. My stomach churned. I stared at the screen, willing it to change. The seconds ticked by, but the numbers refused to shift. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the floor. A soft melody drifted through the room. I froze. It was faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. The haunting waltz from the manor. The air in my apartment grew heavy, pressing against my chest. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around the room. Shadows danced along the walls, their movements erratic and unnatural. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The music grew louder, more distorted, as if it were being played from a broken record. From the corner of the room, a figure stepped forward. It was the woman in silver. Her gown shimmered, but her face was wrong, twisted and warped, her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You left us," she said, her voice a jagged whisper. "But you didn't break the rules." I backed away, my heart pounding. I got out. I escaped. She laughed, a horrible hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "Did you?" she asked, stepping closer. Behind her, more figures emerged from the shadows, the other guests, their faces blank and featureless. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. My apartment twisted around me, the walls stretching and bending like melting wax. The chandelier from the manor suddenly appeared above me, its crystals dripping with something dark and viscous. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "This isn't real. I'm free." Mr. Gray's voice echoed from the darkness, cold and mocking. "Freedom isn't so simple. You belong to the party now." The waltz swelled to a deafening crescendo as the figures closed in. Their hands were cold and unyielding as they grabbed me, pulling me toward the center of the room. The air filled with laughter, twisted, endless laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. When I woke, I was standing in the ballroom of the manor. The chandelier sparkled overhead, the music played on, and the guests twirled gracefully around me. Mr. Gray appeared at my side, his smile sharp and triumphant. "You see," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder, "the party never truly ends." I tried to scream, but no sound came. My body moved of its own accord, my feet falling into step with the waltz. The faces around me blurred into an endless sea of motion, their smiles as empty as my own. Somewhere deep inside, a small part of me still struggled, still hoped. But as the music played on and the clock struck midnight again, I felt that hope slipping away. And in the distance, far beyond the walls of the manor, I knew the next guest was already on their way.